Shalom, everyone. Happy Wednesday to you. Tonight's going to be another, well, I shouldn't say normal night. It'll be unusual again because we're not going to follow the normal King James Bible or the normal Art Scroll Bible. We're going to be looking at the Apocrypha. Tonight's lesson, I kind of call it the rise of the three-headed eagle. The purpose of looking at this is because we're getting close to the end, and I want to talk to you a little bit about what I understand so far regarding the role of the Americas and the United States in particular in the end times prophecies. Obviously, you won't find the United States easily in the King James or any of the other Bibles unless you're looking at Daniel chapter 7 and you begin to reinterpret some of the scriptures. So we're going to look at a book that is called part of the Apocrypha. Now, the Apocrypha itself originally was written in Aramaic, but there's none of the Aramaic texts are left. All that we have left now are the oldest manuscripts are in Greek. And so the Apocrypha is just simply a Greek word, and it means to be hidden. And so we're going to look at some books that have been hidden. Now, originally, they were part of the Bible. And by that, I mean back in the second, third centuries when the Bible was canonized, these books were found in it. Now, they were not found in the Old Testament and they were not found in the New Testament. They were basically what you would call that intertestamental period. That's what they were actually written in. We look at the books that I'm looking at, there's actually 14 of them, but I'm going to only look at the book of Esdras. And in Esdras was written actually in 2 volumes. The first volume, Esdras 1, just deals with the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, and it retells some of the stories and adds new stories to it. So it's an addition. The one I want to look at is the second book of Ezra, and that was written about the time of the burning of the temple and the destruction of the Israeli world. And as I was going through it, it was written probably between 70 AD and 125. That's the approximate age in which it was actually written. Now, it's really kind of diverse, and second is dealing with visions. In fact, Ezra, in this case, they call him Ezra, but if he's living in 70 AD, then he is not the Ezra of the Ezra and Nehemiah. He obviously is a different Ezra, but he has that name, and so when we look at it in Hebrew, his name would be Ezra. But when we look at it in Greek, his name is Esdras. And so that's why the title of the text is Esdras. Now, I want you to understand that this book, it's controversial in some ways. When it was included in what we would call the 1611 King James Bible, it was part of the Bible. It was in there. In fact, my wife has a family Bible back on our shelf that's basically ready to decompose because it was 1827. And it has all of those same stories plus lithographs and all kinds of graphs and charts in it. Back then, there was a lot more that was included in the Bible than there is today. Today, it's basically the words of the scriptures or maybe some notes that would be put on the side. But in 1611, the Bible contained the book of Esdras and the book of 2nd Esdras. So they were there. Now, in about 1855 or 1885, these books were taken out. Now, some people said that they were taken out simply because the fact that there were sections in some of the books that talked about magic, and obviously magic shouldn't be in the Bible, and so they took it out. Well, there were also other reasons why. Some people said it shouldn't be in the Bible because it wasn't in the original Hebrew language. We only had it in the Greek. But others would say, if you want to look at it from the right perspective, understand that it's quoted in other books. And because it's quoted in other books, we should consider it something that, if it's not completely spiritual, should be at least listened to. In fact, Polycarp and many of the original New Testament Christians included it in their Bibles. Some of the Hebrews still go to that and understand it. If you read the War Scrolls, which are one of those Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll find that many of the passages in there come from this book of Esdras. It's a book that is really something that's actually beneficial, but it seems to have lost its focus. So as we're going through this, we're going to be looking in our two cases at two chapters, chapter 11 and chapter 12, which are called the fifth vision of Ezra. Now, before I start, I need to say this. Many of you are going to find this depressing because I'm going to tell you stories that are truth. And I'm going to explain to you where the United States will be by the time of the end. And that's not where most people want to be. That's why there's the belief in the rapture. I don't want to be here when this happens. But that's not what I'm here for. I'm here to talk to you about what's actually there. But I also want to frame it in a positive way. If you read the book of Deuteronomy and you looked at the third chapter, the 22nd verse, my wife showed it to me today and I decided I'd include it. You shall not fear them, for Hashem your God, he shall wage war for you. So we have somebody on our side who's bigger than what's on the other side. But even so, there's a lot in here that's probably disheartening. I'm going to give you history. I'm going to talk to you about economics. I'm going to talk to you about everything that goes along with the text. Now, the text itself, well, before I get started, let me go to my share, see if I can pull it up. Where is it? Here it is. Okay. Here's a graph from the beginning. Oops, I already went to the second page. Third page. Now I'm way off. Excuse me for backing off the screen. Stop my share. I gave you a screen way back when we were doing the book of Daniel. And if you remember the book of Daniel, the 10th, 11th, and 12th chapters, I began to give you some understanding of how time charted on a I don't know, basically a simple chart. And in looking at that chart, it gives you some things that we really need to understand. I had at the bottom of the chart, and maybe I should try and pull it up again, see if I can do it right this time. Now, if I can go back to where I was at originally. Aha. Here's the part that I want to show you. Now, this chart basically dealt with from the period of time in which Israel entered the land with Joshua all the way to the end of time. Time meaning the end of this age. Below the line, if you will look, you will see that I have given you the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. And then I get into the British, the founding of America, and we'll get into the last of the eagle's heads. But we're going to be talking about this portion, the British Empire on through, because you see early on in Constantine, this eagle was formed and it began to move through time. Now, it was not visible, but it started with a man who saw himself as being God, and his name was Constantine. He was the emperor of Rome, and he moved his capital from Rome itself all the way over to Turkey, where he developed a city that he called Constantinople, which today is called Istanbul. And there he established his kingdom. And when the East or the Western Empire fell apart to the Huns and the Germans, his empire was still moving along. In fact, his empire would morph into the Byzantine Empire, and from there into the Ottoman Empire, and from there, well, that's when it disappeared. But anyway, let's go back to the story. So our character starts by pronouncing himself as God. He's called Caesar. But at the same point in time, he sees that there's some religious problems that need to be dealt with. So in 625 CE, he establishes what's called the Council of Nicaea. At the Council of Nicaea, he develops for himself this concept of what the church is about. He establishes the Trinity. He establishes lots of different things. And he sets himself up because you see, he sat over the top of the meeting. Below were the Catholic priests, the Pope was there, and they began to establish Christianity as we would eventually know it. So we go from there, but it's not until the British Empire, it's not until then that we really begin to see this eagle now beginning to fly. Now, if you remember Daniel chapter 7, verse 5, we talk about a lion that had wings on its back. Those wings were the wings of an eagle. And if you remember correctly, Daniel chapter 7, we began with a lion that walked on four legs. It was ferocious. It was vicious. It was gobbling up land. Eventually, it reached the point where it was no longer doing that, and it moved from a four-legged animal to a two-legged animal that stood like a man, indicating that it had changed its ways. It was no longer about adding land. But again, remember, Britain, remember at the height of its glory, the sun never set on the British Empire. But before that time, we also had the 1776, and we had the revolution, or the founding of America. Now, with the founding of America, you're going to have something else happen. And the thing that you're going to have happen is the fact that America does win its freedom. And as it's winning its freedom, it's going to change the world. Because you see, at that point in time, we become the new eagle, the second eagle. And we will talk about the first eagle, the second eagle, and the third eagle as we go through this story. And it's all going to be hidden under the guise of Gog and Magog, which I haven't told you about, but I will by the end of this 3 weeks, I guess, is what it's going to probably take me to get through this. And so I want you to kind of understand what's going on at this point in time. So I need to do now is I want to bring up the text so that you actually can see something, because I'm sure some of you don't have a version of the King James Version of the Bible. Now, remember, I have got the King James Version. We start with verse 1, and then we'll go to verse number 2. I use the King, I use the King James because that's what my wife's Bible was. Now, her King James was obviously different. It was written in 1827. And again, remember in 1885, the Apocrypha was taken out. It's also understood that some of it was the reason for taking it out was the fact of print paper. You add a lot of extra pages that people don't necessarily read, so they took it out. But that's not the only thing that happened over the time. We think that the Bible was canonized and that was fixed and that was it. And the answer is no, it wasn't. There was a period of time when the book of John was not in the Bible. You see, it was too mystical, shouldn't be there. And so John appeared and disappeared and reappeared in the Bible. And in 1888, it passed. It was now part of the standard scriptures. But the Bible has somehow been in flux for a lot of years. So anyway, let's begin. It starts out by saying, "Then saw I a dream, and behold, there came up from the sea." And when we talk about the sea, we're usually talking about in mystical terms, we're talking about the nations. From among the nations came an eagle. Now, this eagle was different than the eagle that we think of in Daniel chapter 7, because it says, which had 12 feathered wings and 3 heads. That doesn't describe the one in Daniel. So we're looking at another facet of this beast as we're looking at it. In verse 2, it says, "And I saw, and behold, she spread her wings over all the earth, and all the winds of the air blew on her and were gathered together." Wind talks to us about turbulence. It talks to us about things that are happening. And if we begin to look at the world began to look very turbulent. from the days of the British Empire. And today it's even more windy. It's even more turbulent than it ever was. But this concept of turbulence is really significant. Now, if we just simply are talking about the eagle and the British Empire, we have to understand that the British Empire in the 15th century actually became the power because of defeating the Spanish Armada. They now became the captain of the seas. Back then, there were no airplanes, so the best method of getting from continent to continent was the ocean. And he who controlled the ocean controlled the trade, and he who controlled the trade controlled the financial world. And so that was what was going on. So our character then became something of an eagle as it goes on. Now, the eagle's wings, in this particular case, there are now 12 of them that are being shared with us. I want to also explain to us, I don't know how many of you understand how the seal of the dollar bill, the eagle, how we came to understand that the United States or America would be the eagle. Well, the eagle was created originally by a Jewish man who basically financed the Revolutionary War. His name was Haim Solomon. Haim Solomon lived in New York or in Philadelphia. And Haim understood the Bible. And when he saw what was going on between Great Britain and now the establishment of the United States, he understood that this country was going to be a key in the end of the ages, and that this country would probably help create Israel on Israeli soil. And so he financed the war. In fact, he even created or organized a division of Jews who actually fought in the war. He was very, very responsible for what was going on. And he was in contact with Jefferson and Washington and all of the rest. He will end up dying penniless because he will have spent it all. And he received loan notes from the government, but the government never paid him back. And so he died penniless. Well, anyway, one of the things that he wanted to make sure happened was when we created our seal, that on our seal would be the eagle. So in the Congress, when they were establishing what we would call the Constitution, there was an argument over what the seal should look like. Benjamin Franklin said the seal should have a beaver on it. The question is, why a beaver? Well, the North American continent was known for fur trading. And so therefore the beaver seemed to be the most likely. But Haim argued, and he had friends enough that they eventually settled on creating the eagle as our national symbol. And so if you look at the back of the dollar bill, you're going to find that eagle back there. That eagle is going to be spreading its wings, but at the same point in time, it's the symbol that we're going to live with all the way to the end of days. Now, as we're going through this, we have to understand some other things. And for a second, I want to skip order and I want to go back and I want to teach you something. It's called bird walking, if you've ever been with me. I tend to bird walk a lot, but as we go through this, how did America get its name? That's the question. Now, you may never have really wanted to know, but I wanted you to at least begin to experience why now. There it is. Where did America get its name? Now, if you look at the picture on the left, it's the picture of Amerigo Vespucci. He was the Spaniard or Italian who actually spent a lot of time traveling the seas, and he was said to be instrumental in the United States or in the world accepting the Americas. Now, the Americas itself, that's Amerigo, I guess that's close enough, and that probably would work. The only problem is that isn't really right. It really doesn't explain what I want you to understand. I want you to understand a little bit more about what's going on in this particular case, because it's kind of hidden information. if you will. It's not something that you see easily on the cover of a magazine. But I want you to look particularly at the man who's sitting there praying. Now, the man who's sitting there praying is called Tupac Amaru, or Amaru, actually. Tupac Amaru. Now, Tupac was the last king of the Incas, and his name means shining serpent. But I want you to look at what he's wearing. I want you to notice his headdress. I want you to notice something else. He called the country Amaruka. Change the U to an I, and I think you get a better idea of what he's talking about. Now, Amaruka happens to mean plumed serpent, feathered serpent. If we look at this characters really close, what we're going to begin to see is the fact that the Americas really speaks of a plumed or a feathered serpent. Now, if you notice his headdress, the feathers behind it, and you notice the skull of the serpent. Now, the serpent in Hebrew is also called a Nahash, taking us all the way back to Genesis chapter 3 and the enticing of Adam and Eve into accepting the forbidden fruit. When we look at our country, there's been a lot of enticing going on from the very first days, and there will continue to be a lot of enticing going on as we look at it. But I want you to also understand something else. When we read history, Voltaire was one of those guys who said, history is made by lying. In other words, nobody really knows much of the truth. We only know the lies that have been told that make up the truth. And so we find ourselves, and again, as Adolf Hitler understood, you tell a lie long enough and often enough, you're going to make it sound true, and people are going to accept it. And so we accepted Amerigo Vespucci and rejected the fact that this actually is the feathered serpent's land. Now, there is I wouldn't recommend you read it. It's a book called The Secret Doctrine. And The Secret Doctrine was written by HP, and her H stands for Helena Blavatsky, who was in charge of worship. Well, different kind of worship. She worshiped the dragon and she worshiped the sun. She was an occultist. In fact, she was instrumental in Karl Marx's life, and she was instrumental in Lenin's life. She was very, very well known and respected. But again, she understood that the earth, this plane, was being controlled by the sun and by the dragon. And so her prayers and her activity was based upon that. Now, we usually think of the dragon as being some middle-aged kind of concept or old age, but it still functions. It's still happening. China is the best example of it. China is where we would go if we wanted to watch a New Year's festival and watch the dragon move down the streets. But it's not the only place. But the dragon becomes very, very significant in what's going on. As we look at this story, then, I want you to understand that we're talking about a real change and not so far. You see, the influences of evil have always been here. Now, as we look at it, we don't normally think of it as that, but understand that we're looking at a very changed world from what it used to be. So I want to cut this off. Now we're back. And now let's go to the dictionary, to the encyclopedia again for share. And let's go back again. Okay, so in the second verse, and I saw and behold, she spread her wings all over the earth, and all the winds of the air blew on her, and were gathered together. Now, to be gathered together speaks of future tense. They haven't finished gathering, but in the end, they will all be gathered together. And we understand from Zechariah, from Daniel, from Ezekiel, all of the prophets, that everything will be gathered together at the end of days. Now, in the third verse, it goes on to say, and I beheld, and out of her feathers there grew other contrary feathers, and they became little feathers and small. Now, eventually we're going to find out that there are 8 of these contrary feathers, 8 of these extra feathers. And that becomes significant or important. And it becomes important for a very different reason as we go through. Back to my story. Back to the page. I want us to look at this. The feathers themselves, there were 12 of them. And then there were 8 contrary feathers. Now, as we begin to look at this, you're going to find out that the first feather or the second feather in this group is going to be longer living than any of the others. Well, if you go and look at our presidents of the United States, begins with Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover, his great contributions actually came during World War I when he wasn't even president. He was in charge of supplying food and nourishment to people who were trapped behind the lines in the World War I between the British and the Germans. First off, he fed the entire nation of Belgium because the Belgians were the first and the Germans refused to feed their enemies. And the English refused to empty the blockade so that food could get to the Belgians. Well, it was Herbert Hoover who convinced the Parliament and convinced the Germans to allow him to bring in food. And so he established a food network that fed Germany or fed Belgium. Well, the war went on and Germany took more land. They took parts of France, northern France. And so the task now changed a little bit because now added to it was France. And so he continued to feed. In fact, he said it cost about $11 million a month to use the train system, the ships, all of the things necessary to get the food to where it needed to be. And so that was his big understanding. He later became president of the United States, and he was there between 29 and 33. Now, if you remember, those were the years of the Great Depression. So you can understand why we didn't want to reelect somebody who couldn't figure out how to get rid of the Depression. We hired him simply because the fact that he had done such a great job providing food for the rest of the world. Well, along came Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he began to create new programs that were going to get us back to work, back to work programs. He created all kinds of things, and he established the Social Security and all of that goes with it. And in doing so, his terms never ended because you see, up until that time, there was no decision that you only could run twice. That was a decision that was made by George Washington way back in the beginning because they wanted him to run a third time. And he says, no, one who continues to run is going to eventually be seen as a king. The United States was not built to be a royalty kind of place. It was meant to be a republic. A republic. What's the difference between a republic and a democracy? Well, in a republic, every voice counts. Every voice has got to be heard. Our nation was originally founded on that very principle because you see, in the very beginning, when we tried to decide on how many electors we're going or legislators we're going to have, it was determined that we were going to establish 2 houses of legislation. One that was going to be active for 2-year terms, and it was based on the number of people that you had in your state. The second one was going to be based on equal proportion. And both of them had to act on any issue in order for it to reach the president. So that's where that came from. So that's the republic. But you see, today people don't want a republic. We call ourselves a democracy. But a democracy is where the majority rules. Not everybody's voice is heard. And it's getting to be to the point where even we're no longer moving from a democracy, we're moving towards socialism, where there is going to be a group of people that are going to make the decisions for us and tell us how good it is because of what we've got. That's where we're headed. That's why there's such a wide difference between the two candidates that are running for office for president. And it's why it's important for all of us to vote and to choose the right one. So anyway, Franklin Roosevelt ruled for 3.5 terms and was passed away, and Harry S. Truman was left in charge. Now, Harry Truman really had no job description. He was the vice president, but he really didn't do anything. Franklin Roosevelt never met with him. Kind of like Biden and his, never mind. I'm getting carried away. But the number of meetings that were held between president and vice president were none. Now, after this whole thing was done, after it finished, he only lasted 1 term, but his 1 term was significant because it included the atomic bomb and the ending of World War II. Now, he was followed by another man who becomes even more famous because of what he did, and that was Dwight Eisenhower, because he fought in the World War II and became the big hero from World War II. And lots of things happened because of him. If you go today and you wanted to get from where I'm living in Houston all the way to Chicago, you have superhighways. One of the first things that Dwight Eisenhower said was, we don't have a road structure that's going to help us when times of war comes and we need to move materials from place to place. And so he established what we call federal highways. That was his one big push. He was also responsible for other things, but the one thing that I want you to understand that he was responsible for was identifying a fear that he had. Now, he lived in the days of the Russian Cold War, but at the same point in time, he feared worse, not the enemy, he feared us. Because you see, he spent the last 10 minutes of his time in office on set, if you will, sitting behind the desk in the Oval Office, and had a 10-minute speech for us in which he said his worst fear was the military complex. The military complex. He was worried about the fact that war would become a way of life in the United States, that we would begin to make weapons and weapons would be used and we would perpetuate that portion of our economy. And it happened. He tried to keep it simple, but he had to have a Defense Department budget and he had to make sure he was taken care of. But at the same point in time, he worried, and he had right to worry. And it continues even on today. In fact, a great portion of the budget is spent not on programs, but on wasteful spending and defense. Both of them create a lot of money or take a lot of money. It's a large drain. But during that time, the United States had things going for it. First off, we were considered heroes because we had won World War II. So the United States began to develop credibility with the world. And so the world began to look at the United States differently. It was back in 1944, before the war was over. 44 nations met in New Hampshire at the Benton Woods Hotel. Now, the Benton Woods Hotel is out in the middle of nowhere, but one of the most significant things happened there. The thing that happened there was the fact that at this particular place, it was decided that there needed to be a world currency. We needed to develop some way that everybody had an equal chance in money. Well, they don't want to create the one world dollar yet because nobody would accept it. But they did accept the idea that we should create a banking system, the IMF. And the banking system was created in 1944. Now, it didn't take place until after that when the United Nations was actually developed. Then we began to develop the IMF. And we used the UN supposedly in order to decide who gets what out of the money that's in this bank. It was also at this point in time that there was lots of talk about equality, the need for equality. Oh, yeah, by the way, 1913, going further back, 1913, we were getting ready for World War I. Woodrow Wilson, who was he's the one who started the League of Nations because he felt it was necessary for all the nations to get together, said, well, we need to be able to pay for our war. And so he established the first income tax. So we began to get the income tax in 1913, and then we began to watch it grow ever since. Because you see, the income tax was only supposed to last until the war was over, and then it was supposed to go away. But obviously that was not the case. So I'm doing a lot of bird walking, but I'm not intending to do what's going on. By 1952, Great Britain was no longer seen as the power. The United States was. The United States was involved in everything. In fact, we became the world police. Remember the Korean War? Remember the Vietnam War? Remember the Afghan War? We were involved in all the wars because we became the police. Right now, we have troops in 70 different nations. We are the police. Well, we were still worried in 1952 about the Russians. But even so, we began to do a lot of things. It wasn't until Ronald Reagan, remember, that the Cold War basically broke. It broke because Russia was broke. Russia had spent all of its money trying to prepare itself for war with the United States. And so we spent dollar for dollar. We began to run up our national debt, but their debt went past what they could afford and they went insolvent. And so when Ronald Reagan went over to West Berlin and said, President Gorbachev, bring down that wall, the wall came down because they no longer had the ability to pay for their troops to be on the wall. It began to change right away. Things continue at this point. Lots of things are happening in the world. America, again, Dwight Eisenhower was afraid of the military complex, military industrial complex, I should say. And so it began to grow after he left because we needed it for all the wars that we were going to be in. And we also needed to supply those who were fighting wars. We supplied the Afghans as they were fighting against the Russians, which really did us a lot of good. But the idea was that we were involved in all of these wars. Now, by 1970, if you don't mind, we established between us and Saudi Arabia, because we were the two largest producers of oil. Can you imagine that? We produced enough oil for the entire world. That isn't the way it works today. But in 1970, we established what we would call a currency. All oil would be traded and sold in dollars, petrodollars. And that's because the United States was the power. And so the petrodollar became the most important ingredient in 1970. Well, as of the beginning of this month, the contract between Saudi Arabia and the United States and the petrodollar is no longer in existence. But it probably died before that because you see, people have seen how we have wasted so much money. China has developed its own petrocurrency. Russia has developed its own. Iran has developed its own. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and all of the rest of them, they've all developed their own. China is now trying to convince all of them that they should use the Petro yuan. That's their currency. Things are going crazy. So anyway, let's go back to our story. Let's go back to here we go. Verse 4. But her heads were at rest. The head in the midst was greater than the others, yet it rested with the residue, or with those contrary feathers. Moreover, I beheld, and lo, the eagle flew with her feathers and rained upon the earth and over them that dwell there. When we begin to look at it, we weren't the British Empire where the sun never set. But as you begin to look across the world in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and so on, our influence was all over the world. We were the nation that everybody looked up to. Now, as we go through this whole idea, I don't know what you want to call it. I lost my page. Here it is. When we went through all of this, lots of things came to mind. Another thing that was coming to mind was we needed to have a banking system that was established. And so who was in charge of establishing the banking system? The United States. Why? Because it was in the United States where the United Nations was. And so it was obvious that it should be here. The only thing is it's not here. It's in Belgium. But it was the International Monetary Fund. Now, we were no longer in control of our own dollar. That happened in 1913 when we created the Federal Reserve System, which is highway robbery, if you ask me, because you see, we're paying somebody to print dollar bills for us, and they're charging us for our own printing and printing press. You see, it's printed in our buildings by us and sold to us. So when you begin to look at the interest rates that you pay, understand that part of that interest rate is caused by the fact that you have just paid for the dollar again that you just bought yourself. Life is very serious at this point in time. By verse 5, it says, Moreover, I beheld, and lo, the eagle flew with his feathers and rained upon the earth and over all that dwell therein. This is crazy. Verse 6, and I saw that all things under heaven were subject to her, and no man speak against her. No, not even one creature. Not in the beginning anyway. We were everything to them at that point. Now, as you're going through this, verse 7 says, and I beheld, and lo, the eagle rose upon its talons and spake to her feathers, saying, if you will, saying what? Watch not all at once. Sleep every one in his own place, and watch by course. So the head of the eagle told the feathers that they were going to rise one at a time. Each one would take its turn and step away. And we began to look at that. And as we were looking at that, there was one very interesting fact that I guess I need to go back and bring up for you. And that's very simple. When we look at our 12 feathers, our presidents, do you notice there's a problem with 12 being the number? You see, the 12th president was William J. Clinton. What about the rest of them? They ruled as president. Why are they not listed among the 12? Well, actually, those are the contrary feathers. Those are the feathers that are going to come up later. And they're contrary, they're opposite. They're not normal. Up until this point in time, an election was an election. There was no controversy. But beginning with number 13, George Bush, we began to, well, I don't know how many of you remember back to the days of who was running at that point in time? Al Gore. Al Gore was Bill Clinton's vice president, felt he deserved to be in charge. After all, he invented the internet, as he said. He also was the character that was supposedly going to change us environmentally. Well, he lost to George Bush Jr., and he lost in the state of Florida. Remember that? The hanging chads. Controversy began with George Bush. Controversy happened at 9/11. Controversy followed him for his 8 years in office. Then it got smoothed out. Well, not exactly. We voted for our first African American, Barack Obama, but there were some things that were happening in the elections in which people were not allowed to get into the polling sites. And so there was controversy then. Then we found that at the second election that he really had no popularity, but yet he won again decisively. And then finally comes Donald Trump. Remember, Donald Trump was supposed to be, well, he was the showman. He wasn't supposed to win. In fact, Barack Obama had anointed not his vice president, Joe Biden, he anointed Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton was supposed to be the president. In fact, they had a party. They had barges out on New York Harbor so that they were going to shoot the fireworks and everybody was going to know that the Democrats were still in charge. But Donald Trump ended up winning. Now, after the election was over, it wasn't over because remember, Hillary challenged the election. We continue on from there and we end up now with what turns into Joe Biden defeating Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, take his credit or his discredit, again, he filed that it was illegal, that there was manipulation going on. And so they began to deal with that. So Joe Biden becomes president. And now here we are looking for number 17. 17 out of 8 contrary feathers. 5 are now being used. And we will decide who that 5th one is, or the 4th one will be in not too long. What is it, 35 days? So our story goes from there. Our story goes from there back to what we're looking at. So I really should catch up. So I'm on verse number 8. Here we go. Verse number 8. Watch not all at once, remember. Watch by your course. And verse number 9 begins by saying to us, but let the heads be preserved for last. Let the heads be preserved for last. Now, if you remember the book of Daniel, in the book of Daniel, remember, we saw these 4 beasts, if you will. And the 4 beasts that we saw were beasts that we would recognize as the Babylonian, the Medo-Persian, the Greek, and the Roman empires. And at the end of that chapter, Daniel was told that these beasts will be here at the end. They will not have died. They will continue. Now remember, as we're looking at this, we're looking at also empires. And Britain became an empire not early on, but Britain became an empire after we went through the, what would you call it? The Muslim period, the Byzantine period. So that's when Britain became the real empire. The United States took its place. It became technically an empire, spreading its influence all over the world. Now, as we go on, Britain has not collapsed. Britain is still there. The United States power is diminishing, and it's diminishing quickly. You see, another thing that's going to hurt us is at the end of this month, we will no longer have the petrodollar to support us because you see that currency will disappear. The petrodollar meant money was always coming into our coffers. If the money isn't always coming in, then you obviously have shortfalls. And if you're having shortfalls, and remember, we have a $33 trillion debt, imagine what it's going to look like when everything is all said and done. Our days as an empire are coming to an end. That's what I'm telling you. As we go on, it begins to say, and I beheld, and the voice went out of her heads. No, the voice went out not out of her heads, but from the midst of her body. We're the body. We're the body. And the voice is going out from us. What are we saying? Well, if we look around the United States today, what would we say? Would we say we're better off? Would we say we're still in charge? What would we say? And that was the question that's posed by this whole understanding. You know, if it wasn't for the Supreme Court, the body really would have nothing to say because the legislature and the president writing his own edicts, determines what's going on. And I numbered the contrary feathers, and behold, there were 8 of them. Now we've watched 5 of them show up. So we're going to be looking at something else. And I looked, and behold, on the right side, there arose 1 feather, and he reigned over all the earth. Now, again, following that up, and it was so that when it reigned and it came to its end, the place thereof appeared no more. So the next following stood up and reigned in a great time. In other words, he reigned longer. So this is our story telling us the presidents and how we can identify which presidents he was talking about. Because obviously we've had 46 presidents so far. And the question then becomes, well, where do you start? So we had to start with Herbert Hoover because the second president is the one that reigned the longest. So now we're looking at all of the presidents and how they've reigned. And it happened that when it reigned and the end of it came also like the first, so that it also disappeared, went no more. Then came there the voice unto it and said, hear thou that last born, that hast borne rule over the earth so long, this I say to thee, thou beginnest to appear no more. So we begin to look at characters that begin to, well, they're no more. There. Verse 15. Then came there a voice unto it and said, hear thou that hast borne rule over the earth so long. This I say unto thee, before thou beginnest to appear no more, there shall none after thee attain unto thy time. So this is the discussion with FDR. Nobody's going to rule as long as you did. That's the point of this whole story. Okay, where am I at? I keep changing my screens. It begins by saying, and then came the voice that said, then no more. There shall be none after thee unto thy time, neither unto a half of that. Then arose a third and reigned as the others before him and appeared no more. It's interesting. This was Harry S. Truman. Up until the end of Harry S. Truman's reign, presidency. He had no idea of a pension. There was no pension system for workers in the United States at that point. He went home just as he came with his last salary check. That was it. Now he goes on to say, so went it with all the residue, one after another. And as everyone reigned, then they appeared no more. Then I beheld, and lo, in process of time, the feathers that followed stood up on the right side, that they might rule. Also, now what did I do? Others that they also followed, that they right side, that they also might rule. But within a while, they no more appeared. For some of them were set up, but ruled not. After this, I looked, and behold, the 12 feathers appeared no more, nor the two little feathers. So he's telling us that there were two characters that were set up to reign, but never did reign. So the question is, who are they? Well, that is a secret that would have to be handled by the Republican and national parties, because they're the ones who would have established who would have run and who would not have run. Now, and there was no more of the eagle's body, but the three heads that rested and the 6 little wings that are left. Remember, it was 8, now it's 6. So if we go to the 6, we're talking about contrary. If we go back to our drawing or our scale on presidents, we have 4 of them have already appeared. George Bush, Barack Obama. Who's next? Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and now we're looking at number 5. That's what's going on at this particular point in time. I wish I had a better system than this. Forgive me for not being technical. He goes on to say, for some of them were not set up, but ruled not. After this, I looked, and behold, the 12 feathers appeared no more. Then it says, and there was no more upon the eagle's body, but the 3 heads that rested in the 6 little wings. Then saw I also 2 little feathers divided themselves from the 6 and remained under the head that was upon the right side, for the 4 continued in their place. Okay, now we got a math problem. 6, 4 ran. That would be George Biden. What's happening with this 5th one? Well, if the prophecy holds true, then Kamala Harris will probably win, but she'll remain under the influence of something else, someone else. The someone else is actually going to be Gog and Magog. And we'll get to that in chapter 12. But that is the direction that we're going to be heading at this point in time. So again, and I beheld the feathers that were under the wing, thought to set up themselves and had to have rule. Fine. What am I on? Oh, goodness.
26.
Lord help me. And I beheld there was no more.
That was verse 26.
Thanks. Yeah. See what happens when you don't have the Apocrypha handy.
I have it here. Would you like me to read the next? This
Well,
one.
let's just keep going, I guess, so people can at least see what's possible. I ask you if you go through this lesson, bring your own apocrypha. You can look at it online, or if you have one of those interlinear Bibles, you'll find that it's the middle section of the Bible. It's something that's easy for you to get a hold of. But I needed to show you tonight because if I didn't, you would have a very difficult time understanding what I'm talking about. So it's really significant that you actually take a look at what's going on here. Now we're on verse 26. And I beheld, and lo, there was one set up, but shortly it appeared no more. And the second was no sooner than the first. So he's talking about these contrary feathers. And so he's talking about, again, George Bush, and he's talking about Barack Obama, and they were no more. So we continue on with this story. Now let's see if I can hold it this way. So 27 says, and the second was sooner than the first. But I beheld, and lo, the two that remained thought also in themselves to reign. And when they so thought, behold, there awakened one of the heads that was at rest. Namely, it was in the midst. So this is the middle head. For that was the greater than the other two heads. And I saw that the two other heads were joined with it. So in other words, they're all three in agreement and they're all three alive. Britain is still alive. That's one of the heads. The United States is one of the heads, and the middle head. They're all alive. And so they're all in agreement at this particular point in time. If you remember what's happened to President Biden, remember President Biden was planning on running. And all of a sudden, everybody agreed that he shouldn't run. And so the campaign was on. So that's what I'm thinking we're talking about at this point. Verse 30 says, and then I saw that the two other heads were joined with it. And 31 says, and behold, the head was turned with them that were with it, and did eat up those last two feathers under the wings that would have reigned. So in other words, the two feathers looked like they were trying to wait and make sure that they could survive. But the bird, the eagle, actually ate them. So we actually don't have 8. We had 6. We've already had 4. We have 2 more. That's if the whole thing plays out the way that it's written here. So he begins to go on, verse 32. But the head put the whole earth in fear, and bare rule in it over all those that dwelt upon the earth, with much oppression. And it had governance of the world more than all the wings that had been. So there's going to be a change. Something is coming that is going to change the whole thing. And the rule won't come from the feathers. The rule will come from the heads. That is what it is predicting. But again, what has Christianity and everyone else said all along? The world is headed towards a one world government. It won't happen, but that's the direction it's moving. People are being put in and people are being taken out simply by order of this invisible government, which I call Gog and Magog, because that's the title that they're going to use at the end of days. Because remember, Gog and Magog has a gematria, a value of 70. And 70 was the value of the number of nations that are found in the book of Genesis, chapter 10. That's where this whole thing comes from. Remember, the first thing that happens after we get past the flood was the establishment of Nimrod and this attempt to make a one world government. This is the same thing. Remember, Nimrod attempted to do so not just simply by force. He also wanted to make it a rule, just like Constantine did. We're going to create a system of rule at this point in time. I've gone over, and I'm going to stop here, and I'll come back to it next week, and hopefully I'll do a much better job running through this, and I can find a simpler way of looking at it. But at this point in time, I want us to understand that we are in the last days. We are there. There is no doubt in my mind that we're there, and I don't think there's doubt in your mind that we're there. But as we get closer and closer, it's easier to start looking back and finding where we've come from and where we're at now. And I think that's part of the hope that we have, is the fact that we know that we know. And again, as Deuteronomy 3 told us, we have a guy on our side who is a better warrior than any of the others. So with that, I want to say thank you for listening for over an hour and watching me fumble through the slides. But anyway, anybody have any questions?